Hello there, people of the internet. I like really big bullets. And I'm not talking about like a cartridge. I'm talking about the specific mass of the projectile going downrange. Whenever it comes to rifle ammunition, I want as heavy of a bullet as possible if I can manage to get that. I think that's one of the reasons why I like my 45-70 trapdoor Springfield so much. Because there's just something about slapping a steel target at 100 yards with a 405 grain bullet. I get it, it's a slow mover, and it's not the most potent of cartridges, especially not the most potent version of 45-70, but it's fun. Dude, I love that feeling. Smacking something with a really large, heavy bullet, and there's a lot of power behind it. But if we're going to be talking about having cartridges that have a lot of power behind it, there's a reason why modern smokeless rounds are so much more powerful than your old school black powder rounds, even though the old school black powder rounds tend to be like 2 times plus heavier than your modern bullets. Your modern rifle bullet, you're looking anywhere from, if we're talking like 30 caliber, which is a very common rifle cartridge, you're looking from like 150 to a 220 grain bullet. 220 grain is a really heavy 30 caliber round, and that's a lot of power going downrange. Like a 220 grain 30-06, that's a lot of beef, that's a lot of horsepower, that's a lot of torque, that's a lot of everything that's going to absolutely devastate whatever it is that you're shooting at. And the reason why, although these are significantly lighter weight bullets, there's a reason why they're so overwhelmingly devastating. Smokeless powder fires projectiles at a significantly higher velocity than black powder could ever achieve. And that's one of the reasons why smokeless powder was so revolutionary for the time period. It just sends these bullets at such higher velocities, which translates to them having significantly more energy on target. Let's go ahead and dive into that a little bit more, because I want to talk about just how detrimental energy transfer is whenever we're talking about faster bullets. So I got 2 8mm Mauser rounds here. One of them is a 155 grain bullet, and one of them is a 198 grain bullet. The 155 grain bullet is going to be moving at about 3,000 feet per second, or at least it should be. And the 198 is going to be more like, we're going to call it 2650. It depends on the country, the manufacturer, the barrel length, etc., etc. So we're just going to settle on 2650. That bullet is moving significantly slower, but it has more weight. Well, the faster bullet is significantly more devastating on targets, especially soft gelatinous targets, especially if it yaws, simply because it has more energy, because it is traveling faster. Whenever you double a bullet's weight, you double the energy that it has. But whenever you double its velocity, you quadruple the energy that it has to transfer onto its target. And whenever I say that, a lot of people don't really grasp the comprehending nature of that. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little analogy. This analogy is not a correct and direct statement. It is just something I am using in order to help you guys understand. Let's say we have a projectile that's traveling 2,500 feet per second, right? And we keep that same bullet weight. Or rather than that, let's say we have a bullet moving at about 2,500 feet per second, and we increase the mass to equal the amount of increased energy that you would get from 200 feet per second increased velocity, right? So the bullet is a little bit heavier to get the same amount of energy that you would get if you increase the bullet by 200 feet per second. With that increase of mass, that increased velocity would be more like, if we have a 1-to-1 ratio of increasing energy transfer, it would be more like increasing it by 400 feet per second, since there is a doubling of energy. So if we take that same analogy, and from a 1-to-1 ratio, if all things are equivalent, if we just increase that velocity 200 feet per second versus having the energy increase of a 400 feet per second, we would have more like an energy increase of 800 feet per second, because you quadruple the amount of energy onto your target, which is why velocity is so overwhelmingly overpowered whenever it comes to creating projectiles that have a lot of energy to transfer onto their target. The mass allows deeper penetration into that target to allow energy to be able to properly transfer onto that target and tear it up and do whatever it is that it's going to do. So there's a delicate balance between weight and velocity, and for the most part, we've basically figured all of that out in terms of the different projectiles that we use. Bullet construction also has a really big part of it, and there's a whole arguing point behind that, but we'll go ahead and save that one for another video. The increase of velocity increases energy onto your target significantly more than the increase in mass. Like, for example, actually, to go ahead and hammer this home a little bit more onto just how much of a difference this is, we have 4570. That's a 405 grain bullet moving, we're going to just round the number out, at about 1,500 feet per second. We're going to go ahead and use that as a normal standard base analogy. Let's say that we have a really, really hot and spicy 8mm Mauser at 200 grains, moving at about 3,000 feet per second. That's a little bit faster than you would come to expect from 8mm Mauser, but we're going to go ahead and say that. So we got a lighter weight projectile, in fact, half the mass of that 4570, but it's moving at twice the velocities. So we got half the mass of the bullet weight, which means we have half the energy, but then we quadruple it because of that velocity, and we're looking at a bullet that, although it's half the mass, has twice the energy of that 4570 that we just discussed, which is insane. That is nuts, and that's all just achieved from velocity of the projectile and not mass, and that 200 grain bullet's still going to punch pretty gosh darn deep, and likely take out, assuming you have proper bullet construction, likely take out whatever it is that you fire at, like, anywhere in the world. Not unless you're doing some safari hunting over in Africa, but even then, that has enough horsepower to put down whatever it is you want to put down, assuming that you can actually hit your target properly with whatever it is that you're shooting at. Whenever it comes to velocity, there's so much riding on it. Like, for example, look at the 5.56 cartridge. The 5.56 is directly dependent on velocity in order to achieve terminal effectiveness, like really be effective on target. It was designed around a 55 grain bullet, lead core, and it was designed around a 20-inch barrel. This way you would get about 3,200 feet per second from that projectile. And whenever that little tiny projectile, which is lead core, mind you, whenever that smacks a target at those really high velocities, it essentially disintegrates upon impact and dumps a tremendous amount of energy onto its target just because it's booking it at those speeds. Remember, if you want to maintain your bullet for penetration, then you want to have a lot of weight in it, because that weight is going to keep momentum as it punches through whatever it is you're punching through. So if you have a nice lightweight bullet, once it smacks into whatever it's going to smack into, it dumps all of that energy onto its target because it doesn't have the mass to keep going, and oftentimes it does that by completely disintegrating, and it is absolutely horrendous, the effects that it has on soft, gelatinous material. Now, if you're trying to punch through a harder material like stone or something like that, then you might have a little bit more difficult of a time, and you might want those heavier bullets for more adequate penetration. But the velocity and the energy transfer from those 5.56 55 grain projectiles, those can be overwhelmingly effective from those velocities, but those same projectiles with that same weight simply cannot be all that effective if you start to shorten the barrel, especially if you start to shoot at longer distance targets. As you shorten the barrel to like 14.5 inch, which is the standard M4 barrel length, or even shorter, like your 10-inch barrels and whatnot, 5.56 dramatically loses its effectiveness because it is very dependent on velocity, because it's a lightweight bullet moving really fast. That's where the energy comes from. It comes from moving really fast. It doesn't get its power from mass. As a matter of fact, it relies on that velocity and that lack of mass to be able to smack onto a gelatinous target and completely disintegrate and dump all of its energy onto that target immediately, which is a very, very effective means of putting down whatever it is that you're shooting at. It relies on that lack of mass, and all of its effectiveness comes from that velocity. and the amount of energy it gets from that velocity is nuts, considering how tiny of a projectile that is. So that's my rant on just how important velocity is in comparison to bullet weight. Although I do prefer heavier weight bullets, but that's just me. Like, there's just something about sending a 198 grain full metal jacket from an 8mm Mauser into steel at 300 yards. There's just something magic about it. But I understand the capabilities of velocity. So thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below is a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check that out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day. I'll see you on the next episode.
Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garrett. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.